Okay, so this video is going to be showing the differences between EJ9's pre-facelift and facelift and EK9's pre-facelift and facelift, but only the body and frame differences on these cars. So just between the body and the framework on these cars, there are quite a few differences which are a little bit weird and niggly, especially when you're doing some jobs. And if you're making like a high quality replica, you'll need to know these bits. Okay, so on the rear of pre-facelift EJ9s, you can see they have no rear crash bar, and you can see the holes are blanked across there. On the rear of the facelift EJ9, you can see they've got quite a large, weighty rear crash bar, and then obviously the holes there to mount it. And on the EK9s, facelift and pre-facelift, they all have this same lightweight rear crash bar, and again, the same holes as the facelift EJ9 to mount it. So then underneath the EK9, you've got this small chassis brace that goes across on the rear subframe. Now, there has been some debate whether the rear subframe itself is also made of thicker steel on the EK9s. Whereas you can see on the EJ9 facelift and pre-facelift, there is no supporting bar across the rear subframe there. So EJ9 facelift and pre-facelift haven't got rear anti-roll bars, whereas the EK9 has. But I'll go into specifics about that in another video for suspension stuff. Moving forwards from there, obviously all the rear quarter panels between all models are exactly the same. And then you've got, obviously some EJ9 models are sunroof edition, some are tin tops, but all EK9s are tin tops. Okay, so the floor plan / rear seat area on facelift and pre-facelift EK9s is exactly the same. EK9 shells, the actual framework that we're talking about here, is exactly the same between pre-facelift and facelift. But the way it differentiates from the facelift EJ9 and the pre-facelift EJ9 is interesting. So EK9 shells are basically pre-facelift EJ9 shells with front and rear crash bars, and also that rear subframe brace. Also, the seat belts mount slightly differently, which I'll cover in a second. So where the front of the rear seats clip in on facelift EJ9s, you've got this large crash bar which bolts in under the floor. So this is different to the EK9s and the pre-facelift EJ9s, as they don't have this side impact bar. So this has a knock-on effect to the carpet for the facelift EJ9s is different. Also, the rear plastics is different because they're a different shape. So in regards to a replica, say you had a facelift EJ9 and you wanted to make it a bang-on perfect replica as good as you can, obviously you would unbolt that crash bar and then you'd get, you know, an EK9 carpet, an EK9 rear plastics, or pre-facelift EJ9 rear plastics, and then paint them or dye them black. So you'd have that perfect spacing. But here you can see what happens when you haven't got that rear crash bar, which sits under the rear seats, and you've got facelift plastics. You can see that massive gap there. So another interesting bit between UK spec EJ9s and then the JDM EK9s is that the EK9's front seat belts are single point attachment, whereas the EJ9's are twin point attachment. So obviously on the EJ9 shells, both you've got two threaded holes for the lower part of the seat belt to attach, whereas on the EK9 you've got both holes are there, but only one of them has got the nut on the back. So again, when I transferred everything from an EJ9 across to an EK9 shell when I was reshelling one, I tried to use obviously the EJ9 seat belts, and obviously I couldn't do that, so I had to get single point front seat belts. I'll go through in another video when I'm talking about interior stuff, what models you can get them from and things like that. So where the seat belts mount, again, you've got some differences again. So on the pre-facelift, there's no SRS plug on the seatbelt reel. So you can see that it comes in there sort of triangle shape at the top, like the framework around where the seatbelt reel sits. But on the facelift EJ9 and EK4, you can see it's a larger seatbelt reel. So obviously the panel there is more squared off on the right-hand side. And then on the EK9, you can see it's got that same squared off side as the facelift EJ9, which is interesting because the EK9 facelift and pre-facelift hasn't got an SRS plug on the seatbelt reel. So I'm not really sure why that's there. It's just a small difference in the framework. So the only time you'll ever run into this issue is, say you've got a pre-facelift EJ9 and then you buy a set of facelift EJ9 seat belts to fit into it, obviously they don't fit very well, so you end up having to bend the metalwork slightly on the right side to get it to fit in there, which I've done before. But in regards to EK9 replica and stuff like that, you shouldn't have any issues there. I just thought it was a noteworthy point to mention. So now you can see here, this is how the EK9 rear seats brackets sit, which is completely different to EJ9 facelift and pre. So whereas the EK9 ones just slot in, the EJ9 and the EK4 facelift and pre, they bolt in using these little brackets. So the centre bracket there has got a hole in it for the bolt to go through, and then either side on where the plastics are, there's a threaded hole obviously for the bolt to go in, whereas on the EK9 you can see it's just a hole there. Now obviously this means you can't fit EK9 rear seats directly into an EJ9 facelift or pre-facelift without a little bit of work. So what I had to do was I had to take the covers off of the EK9 ones, take the covers off of my EJ9 ones, and then recover them over. It's actually not a difficult process, but it's just something you have to bear in mind when you're doing that job. And then the lower portion of the seat, obviously we spoke about earlier how it fits different depending on whether you have that side impact bar or not. So moving forwards, between EJ9 UK spec and then obviously the EK9s, there's no differences in the bulkhead or the sort of centre floor plan. In the engine bay, like front chassis legs, front slam panel, again, zero differences between pre-facelift EJ9, facelift EJ9 or the EK9s there. So now pre-facelift EJ9s didn't have front crash bars, they had just these little stubs bolted onto the front slam panel on the front of the chassis legs. Whereas the facelift EJ9 and the pre-facelift EK9 and facelift EK9 all had this large front crash bar, except for the race base edition EK9, which had this lightweight front crash bar. So then EK9s and then also the EK4s have the 4 studs welded to the chassis for the front strut bar to bolt to, which obviously the EJ9s don't. So now in the EJ9s you have a lot of sound deadening, which is obviously a lot of weight, and in the EK9s they didn't fit that to save weight. But I have read that some EK9s came with a bit of sound deadening under the driver's seat. I haven't seen it on any of mine, but apparently that is the case on some. And then the final frame / body difference on these is the VIN number. Obviously the VIN number is on the same place on the bulkhead, but then the VIN plate on EK9s it's riveted to the top of the slam panel, and obviously on the EJ9s it's riveted onto the bulkhead itself. So the final bit is the supposed seam welding on the EK9s. Now I have never seen any seam welding on them, and when I've read on the forums a little bit, other people haven't either. But I think what has actually been done on the EK9s is they've had more spot welds done in areas to make it a stiffer shell. So without sitting down and literally counting spot welds, I'm not going to say like that's a definite that's the case. But yeah, for structural shell, welded, bolted on bits, which I consider chassis, they're all the differences that I know of. Obviously do comment if there's anything that I've missed. I'm sure there has been a few bits. And then obviously in other videos, I'm going to break down the interior, the different plastic colours and the different trim bits and stuff like that. But this is just purely the structural side of it.